A lot of people wonder about the Oneida community. Did they really live the way stories say? Do they actually practice something called complex marriage? You hear whispers, you read a little, and it always sounds a bit wild, maybe even scandalous. But it's important to understand what they really did and why. It wasn't just some random experiment in living. It came from deep beliefs, and it shaped a whole community for decades in 19th century America. Here's the story of the Oneida community, how it started, what they believed, and what complex marriage really meant to them. Imagine America in the early to mid 1800s. It was a time of big change, big ideas, and a lot of religious excitement. People were moving around, new towns were popping up, and there was this strong feeling that society could be made better, even perfect. This was especially true in Western New York, a place some called the Burned Over District. It got that name because so many religious revivals and new movements swept through it, like a fire. Into this world came John Humphrey Noyes. He was born in 1811 in Brattleboro, Vermont. His family was pretty well off and educated. His father was a businessman and a politician, a congressman even. His mother was a devout woman. Noyes went to Dartmouth College, a good school. He studied law for a bit. But he felt a different pull. He was searching for something more, something deeper than just law books. He decided to go into ministry. He enrolled at Andover Theological Seminary and then Yale Divinity School. He was really serious about his faith, but Noyes wasn't content with just repeating what others taught. He was a thinker, a questioner. He read the Bible constantly. He prayed. He wrestled with big ideas. He wanted to understand God's will perfectly, and what he started to believe was pretty radical for his time. Most Christians believed that sin was part of human nature. You tried your best, you asked for forgiveness, and maybe after you died you'd find perfection in heaven. But Noyes started to think differently. He believed that true Christians could actually achieve perfection on earth. Not just try to be good, but literally overcome sin. He called this perfectionism. This idea wasn't totally new, but Noyes pushed it further than almost anyone. He believed that Jesus' second coming wasn't just a future event, but something that had already happened spiritually in 70 AD. Because of this, he thought the millennium, a 1,000-year period of peace and righteousness, had begun. And if the millennium was here, people could and should live without sin. They could establish God's kingdom on earth. His views caused a big stir. When he shared these ideas with his professors and fellow students at Yale, they were shocked. This was heresy to them. They saw him as dangerous. He lost his license to preach. He was cast out of the established church, but Noyes wasn't deterred. He felt he was simply following God's truth. He believed he had discovered a deeper understanding of Christianity than the mainstream churches. This rejection just strengthened his resolve. He started gathering a small group of followers who shared his vision. They weren't looking for a quick fix or an easy life. They were searching for a way to live out these radical beliefs. They wanted to build a society where sin was truly conquered, where people lived in harmony, and where selfishness was a thing of the past. Noyes and his followers started small. They lived in his family home in Putney, Vermont for a while. They tried to live by these new principles, sharing everything, praying together, discussing their beliefs. But as their numbers grew and as their ideas became even more unconventional, especially about marriage, which we'll get to, they faced more and more opposition from their neighbors. People found their beliefs unsettling, maybe even threatening. The pressure became too much in Putney. Noyes was even arrested for adultery. Though he was acquitted, he knew they couldn't stay there if they wanted to build the kind of community he envisioned. They needed a place where they could practice their beliefs freely, without constant harassment. And so in 1848, Noyes led his followers to a new location in Oneida, New York. This move marked the real beginning of what would become known as the Oneida Community. They were looking for freedom, and they were ready to build a new world based on their very unique understanding of God's will. It was a bold step driven by a man who truly believed he was doing God's work, even if it meant turning society's norms completely upside down. So John Humphrey Noyes and his small group moved to Oneida, New York in 1848. This wasn't just a geographical move, it was a foundational moment. They were not just starting a new settlement, they were building a new way of life from the ground up. They aimed to create a perfect society, a kingdom of God on earth. This was a big claim, and it meant rethinking almost everything about how people lived. The core of their belief system was Noyes' perfectionism. He taught that people could live without sin. And if you could live without sin, then many of the rules and structures of the sinful world no longer applied. This included things like private property and, crucially, traditional marriage. Noyes saw a lot of problems with how society was organized. He believed that selfishness was at the root of most of these problems. And he felt that traditional, exclusive marriage where one man and one woman were bound to each other for life, was a prime example of this selfishness. He called it particular love. He thought it created a kind of idolatry where a couple would focus all their love and attention on each other or on their immediate family, neglecting the larger community and God. This, he believed, went against the Christian ideal of universal love, where everyone should love their neighbor as themselves. He also believed that traditional marriage, with its focus on two people, created artificial barriers within the community. It bred jealousy, possessiveness, and eventually conflict. If they were truly going to be one family, a brotherhood, as he often called it, then these divisions had to go. So, Noyes introduced the concept of complex marriage. This wasn't some kind of free-for-all, as many outsiders wrongly assumed. It was a highly structured, carefully regulated system designed to eliminate exclusive attachments and promote universal love among all members. It was, in his view, a direct application of his perfectionist theology. If sin was overcome, then sexual relations could be redeemed and integrated into a holy life, rather than being confined to exclusive pairs. The idea was that every man in the community was married to every woman, and every woman to every man. No one person belonged to another. All adults were available to each other, not in a random way, but as part of a communal network of love and fellowship. This was radical, even for the burned-over district. For Noyes, this wasn't about sex for pleasure alone. It was about creating a higher spiritual union, a practical way to demonstrate that selfishness had been conquered. It was a way to practice universal love in the most intimate parts of life. He believed it would break down the possessiveness that he saw as inherent in traditional marriage and promote a deeper sense of unity within the community. Beyond complex marriage, other key principles guided their life at Oneida. They practiced community of property. This meant no one owned anything individually. Everything, land, buildings, tools, resources, and even the clothes on their backs, belonged to the whole community. When you joined Oneida, you gave up all your possessions to the common good. This was another way to eliminate selfishness and foster a sense of shared responsibility. They believed that by sharing everything, they could remove the economic inequalities and competition that plagued the outside world. They also believed in mutual criticism. This was a unique practice where a member who had a fault or was struggling would sit before a committee or the whole community. Other members would then offer frank, direct feedback about their character and behavior, pointing out their weaknesses. The person being criticized was expected to listen without defending themselves, to humbly accept the feedback, and to use it for self-improvement. Noyes himself often underwent criticism. This practice was meant to keep everyone accountable, prevent pride, and ensure everyone was striving for perfection. It sounds harsh, and it could be, but they saw it as a spiritual tool for growth, a way to polish each other's characters. Another important aspect was male continence. This was a birth control method they developed and practiced. Noyes believed that sexual intercourse had two main purposes: procreation and spiritual union fellowship. He taught that if the goal was not procreation, men should practice continence, that is, they should control ejaculation. This allowed for sexual expression and intimacy without unwanted pregnancies. It was quite advanced for its time, and it showed a practical side to their idealism. It meant that women were not constantly pregnant, which was a huge deal in the 19th century. It also allowed them to manage the community's population growth consciously. These principles, perfectionism, complex marriage, community of property, mutual criticism, and male continence, formed the bedrock of the Oneida community. They weren't just abstract ideas, they were deeply integrated into daily life, guiding every interaction, every decision. They were building a whole new social order, convinced that they were living out God's plan on earth, showing the world what a truly Christian, sin-free society could look like. And for a long time, it actually worked. When people hear complex marriage, they often picture something chaotic, maybe even immoral. But at Oneida, it was anything but. It was a highly structured system, carefully managed and deeply intertwined with their spiritual beliefs. It wasn't about casual hookups or free love in the modern sense. It was about redirecting love and affection from exclusive pairings to the entire community. First, remember the core idea: every man was married to every woman, and every woman to every man. This meant there were no exclusive couples living together, no husbands and wives in the traditional sense. People might sleep in separate rooms or in shared dormitories, though later, private rooms were more common, still with the understanding that they weren't exclusive. The goal was to eliminate the possessiveness and jealousy that Noyes believed were inherent in traditional marriage. So, how did pairings happen? It wasn't random. Members didn't just pick who they wanted to be with. Instead, there was a system of ascending fellowship. This meant that older, more spiritually advanced members, often Noyes himself or a committee of senior figures, would suggest pairings. A younger man might be encouraged to seek intimacy with an older, more experienced woman who could guide him spiritually. Likewise, a younger woman might be paired with an older man. The idea was to foster spiritual growth and ensure that relationships were not driven by mere physical attraction or personal preference, but by the betterment of the individual and the community. If a man wanted to be with a woman, he would usually approach an older woman, often a senior matron or Noyes himself, to express his interest. This request would then be considered. The woman's consent was absolutely essential. No one was forced into a relationship they didn't want. This was a crucial point, often overlooked by critics. Women had agency and could decline advances. If the match was approved, the two would spend time together. This might involve conversations, shared work, or physical intimacy. The practice of male continence was central to how complex marriage operated. Noyes taught that sexual intercourse had two distinct purposes: propagation, making babies, and social spiritual union, expressing love and bonding. He believed that if a couple was seeking only the latter, then the man should practice continence. This meant he should engage in sexual activity but consciously control himself to avoid ejaculation. This was seen as a way to separate pleasure from procreation, allowing for intimacy without the burden of unwanted pregnancies. It also gave women a lot of freedom from constant childbearing, which was revolutionary for the 19th century. For Noyes, it was a spiritual discipline, a way to master one's physical self and direct sexual energy toward higher communal purposes. If the community did decide they wanted children, they would engage in stirpiculture or scientific propagation. This was their term for planned breeding. A special committee, or Noyes himself, would select certain men and women who were deemed to have the best physical, intellectual, and spiritual qualities. These chosen individuals would then be encouraged to have children together. The goal was to produce a generation of perfect children, improving the human stock of the community. This was not a random or selfish act. It was a communal decision, an attempt to actively guide human evolution for the good of the group. The children born under stirpiculture were seen as gifts to the community, not just to their biological parents. Children, once born, were not raised by their biological parents in an exclusive way. Instead, they were raised communally in the children's house. They lived, ate, played, and were educated together. Biological parents could visit their children, but the primary care and upbringing were handled by appointed caregivers from the community. This was another way to break down exclusive family ties and ensure that children saw everyone in the community as their family. It was meant to foster a strong sense of community loyalty from a very young age. This complex marriage also involved a lot of open communication and transparency. Secrets were discouraged. If there were issues or jealousies, and they did happen because humans are humans, they were often brought up in mutual criticism sessions. Someone struggling with possessiveness over a partner might be criticized for it, and the community would help them work through those feelings. The entire system was designed to dismantle the very idea of exclusive ownership over another person's body or affection. So, complex marriages was not a license for wild behavior. It was a carefully constructed system, built on deep theological convictions and maintained through strong social pressures and rules. It was an attempt to create a higher, more spiritual form of human relationship, free from what Noyes saw as the selfish and divisive aspects of traditional marriage. It was a radical experiment in human social engineering, and for decades it was one of the most defining and controversial features of the Oneida community. They believed it was a path to a more perfect, more loving, and more unified society. The Oneida community was a lot more than just its unique marriage system. It was a full-fledged society striving for perfection in every aspect of life. To outsiders, the marriage part always got the most attention, but inside the community, everyday life was also carefully organized and incredibly productive. First, they had to support themselves. When they started, they were pretty poor. Noyes encouraged them to work hard, and they did. They tried various small ventures. They grew crops, but that wasn't enough. They were always looking for ways to make money and sustain their growing numbers. One of their first successful businesses was making steel traps. They made high-quality traps that were known throughout America. This business brought in good income. Later, they got into manufacturing silk thread. They built a factory and employed many community members, but their most famous and enduring business success came from making silverware. They started with a small operation making spoons. Eventually, this grew into the enormously successful Oneida Silversmiths, a company that still exists today, though in a different form. Their businesses thrived for a few reasons. They had a strong work ethic. Everyone was expected to contribute. There was no idleness. And because they shared everything, there was a strong incentive for everyone to work for the common good. They also focused on quality and innovation. Noyes was smart about business, and he encouraged members to develop skills and try new things. They were also very organized, using their communal structure to manage production efficiently. Your daily life in Oneida was structured and disciplined. The big house, their main residence, was a large, impressive building. It had rooms for sleeping, a huge dining hall, a common library, a meeting hall, and workshops. Everyone ate meals together in the dining hall. This wasn't just practical, it reinforced their sense of unity. Conversations often revolved around community matters, spiritual discussions, and news of their businesses. The work was rotated. No one was stuck doing the same job day in and day out if they didn't want to be. A person might spend a few months in the trap shop, then move to the gardens, then help with childcare, then assist in the kitchen. This provided variety, prevented boredom, and ensured everyone understood different aspects of the community's operations. It also meant that skills were broadly distributed among the members. Education was highly valued. Children, as we discussed, were raised communally in the children's house. They received a good education, blending academic subjects with practical skills. They were taught to read, write, and do arithmetic, but also learn about farming, manufacturing, and community values. The goal was to raise well-rounded, productive, and committed community members. Adults also engaged in lifelong learning, with lectures, discussions, and access to a good library. Their health was another important consideration. They emphasized hygiene, good diet, and exercise. They were early advocates of things like whole grains and vegetarianism long before it became popular. They also had their own doctors and nurses within the community. There was a strong belief that a healthy body contributed to a healthy spirit. Governance was also unique. While Noyes was the undisputed spiritual leader, he often sought input from the community. Decisions were made through a process that involved discussion and consensus, often guided by Noyes. The mutual criticism system also played a role in governance, as it kept leaders and members accountable. There were no formal elections or complex political structures, as they believed that God's will, as interpreted by Noyes, should guide them. The art and culture were also part of Oneida life. They had a community orchestra, theater productions, and regular social gatherings. They enjoyed music, dancing, and intellectual discussions. Life wasn't all work and spiritual striving. There was also time for recreation and cultural enrichment. They even built a beautiful common room with a stage, showing their commitment to shared enjoyment and artistic expression. Their overall success was remarkable. For over 30 years, the Oneida community thrived. They grew to over 300 members. They were financially prosperous, socially stable, and surprisingly harmonious for such a radical experiment. They showed that a community based on shared property and unconventional social structures could not only survive, but also flourish in a competitive capitalist environment. They were often visited by curious outsiders, some skeptical, some genuinely interested in their unique way of life. They were a living, breathing example of a utopian vision, demonstrating how far people would go to create a truly perfect society based on their deeply held beliefs. The Oneida Community, for all its success and radical design, eventually came to an end in its original form. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a gradual process driven by both internal and external pressures. The year 1879 marked a turning point. One of the biggest internal factors was the aging of John Humphrey Noyes. He was the founder, the prophet, the charismatic leader who held the whole system together. He was getting older and his health was declining. The question of succession became a major issue. Who would lead the community after him? No one really had his unique blend of spiritual authority and practical genius. Without Noyes at the helm, the community's cohesive spiritual and social structure started to show cracks. Another major internal strain came from the practice of stirpiculture, or planned breeding. While it had been a key part of their experiment, it also caused some discomfort and division. By the late 1870s, many of the children born through stirpiculture were growing up and becoming adults. Some of them questioned the system, feeling that it had unfairly dictated their parentage and relationships. There was a growing generational divide within the community. Some of the younger members especially started to chafe under the strictures of complex marriage and the communal upbringing. Externally, the world was changing, and the Oneida community was facing renewed criticism. The religious leaders and moral crusaders in the outside world, particularly a powerful Presbyterian minister named Rev. John W. Mears, began to openly attack the community. They labeled complex marriage as immoral and scandalous. There was growing public outrage, fueled by sensationalized reports. The legal system was also becoming a threat. There were fears that the state of New York might intervene, prosecuting Noyes and other leaders for practices like adultery or polygamy, which were illegal. Noyes, realizing the increasing danger to his community and himself, made a difficult decision. In 1879, to protect the community from legal action and to ease internal tensions, he announced the end of complex marriage. He did this from a safe distance, as he had fled to Canada to avoid potential arrest. And his son, Theodore Noyes, played a key role in explaining this difficult decision to the community members back in Oneida. The immediate aftermath was a period of confusion and adjustment. With complex marriage abolished, the community members had to decide how to live. Many couples who had formed strong, albeit non-exclusive, bonds under the old system now chose to formalize their relationships and marry each other. Over 50 traditional marriages took place within the community in a short period. This meant the re-establishment of the nuclear family structure within the community walls. Complex marriage, however, was just the first step in the community's transformation. Without the core theological and social glue of Noyes' radical perfectionism, the communal property system also became unsustainable. There was no longer a clear spiritual justification for everyone sharing everything. Members began to demand their individual shares of the community's considerable assets. So, in 1881, the Oneida Community formally dissolved as a communist society. They reorganized themselves into a joint stock corporation called Oneida Community Ltd. This meant that the communal property was converted into shares of stock, distributed among the former members. Each member received shares based on their initial contribution and their years of service to the community. This corporate structure allowed the successful businesses, particularly the silverware manufacturing day, to continue. And they did continue, with great success. Oneida Community Ltd. went on to become Oneida Silversmiths, a major global brand in flatware and tableware for over a century. The company's success proved that the community members were incredibly capable entrepreneurs and managers, even after shedding their radical social experiment. The legacy of the Oneida Community is complex. On one hand, it's a story of an ambitious social experiment that ultimately failed to sustain its most radical aspects. It shows the difficulties of trying to create a perfectly harmonious society, especially when challenged by external pressures in human nature itself. The practices of complex marriage and stirpiculture remain controversial, raising questions about individual freedom, social control, and what constitutes ethical living. But on the other hand, the Oneida Community was a remarkable achievement. For over 30 years, it was a thriving, self-sufficient, and often prosperous society. They demonstrated that it was possible to live without private property, to reimagine family structures, and to sustain a unique communal life. They pioneered progressive ideas in education, gender equality, women had a relatively high status, and participated in all aspects of work and birth control. Their business acumen left behind a successful company that employed generations of people. The Oneida Community stands as a powerful example of 19th century American utopianism. It was a bold attempt to live out a radical vision of human perfection and communal love, driven by deep spiritual convictions. It reminds us that people have always dreamed of better ways to live, and sometimes they even try to build them.